All right. Hi, everyone. So my name is Michele. I have, as you've heard, I joined this department last year. So this is my first year in Michigan. And so even though I'm not going to talk necessarily about why I chose Michigan, and you're going to see some of the things that motivate my research only today, I would want to second everything that Bramar said. I think Michigan is a great place to be. And I made the choice to come here because of the things that I saw in Michigan. So I urge you to consider where you're going also in terms of your quality of life. And I think that Michigan and Ann Arbor and the university here and the department all have amazing opportunities for everybody. So yeah, today I am going to talk about some of the things that motivate my research and my work, and some of the things that you would see if you took a course with me, which is currently ongoing. Some of the students, I think, here are aware of that and scared of me. So yeah, I mostly work on spatial statistics and models with Gaussian processes. But the applications that I want to work on are very diverse. And so here I'm going to talk about how we can use potentially the same methods to understand the dynamics of cancer in the microenvironment of the tumor, the cell, the tissues, but also when you want to diagnose the effects of climate change in the macro environment, right? So the Earth. And these two things, even though they are very different from each other, actually they are pretty similar. And I'm going to try to convince you and motivate you to possibly do work on this. And there's multiple faculty here, members that are also working on Gaussian processes and scalable Gaussian processes for very nice applications in medicine. So I urge you to also consider that there are many other things that you can do with the same kind of structure. Let's see if I can. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, in the past, just as to make you understand who's talking to you, I don't necessarily have only a background in statistics or mathematics. I come from economics, and so I'm also interested in the social aspects, but currently I'm working on those things that I was mentioning. And in my research, most recently, I've been working on Bayesian statistical methods, applications, algorithms, and software. So another thing that I do is develop software packages that you can use in R, open source. And some of the research questions that I have is, for example, what are the local impacts of climate change? We've been studying it at a global level. Is there climate change? What can it be attributed to? But I wanted to understand more about, so how does it affect people and society locally, for example? How are ecosystems changing? And some of them may change in different ways. And so maybe if you take the average, you see no change, but then if you look locally, you see many changes. Same thing in terms of what is the impact of poor air quality on health. Last year, actually every year in parts of the US, there's fires, and so people breathe in a lot of poor air from smoke from those fires. How is that impacting them? And also, other topics such as the interaction effects on health outcomes, and the other thing that I was mentioning, how does cancer affect the spatial relations between cells, right? So one thing that I just heard was the importance of AI methods, but what AI methods in medicine cannot do yet, they can make predictions, and frequently they're very good predictions, but can they explain why they make those predictions? And so one of the things that I want to do in my research is being able to develop models that can explain, can tell you, can have as a human, learn why things are happening, right? Because that's how we move on to the next step in research, like to get new ideas, new directions. So first, let me start with some climate change diagnostics, right? So this is one part of the things, and mostly what I've been working on in my recent past. So the questions, as I was mentioning, is how do ecosystems develop in terms of climate change? What is the effect of human intervention, and so on. And so in these situations, we have a multitude of data sources, right? So we have weather stations, on the ground. We have satellite imaging that take pictures at regular intervals of Earth. We have remote sensing, such as LiDAR sensors that take depth measurements, camera traps to see whether there's animals around, and citizen scientists, meaning just people who walk around and take notes, right? So many data sources. And one example of this, this kind of set of problems is, again, air quality monitoring. And so we have a weather station that measures also the quality of air. We have fires, and this is going to have impacts on human health. And so this is one topic that I am interested in, but also relates to the research that I've been doing and the models that I develop. And here's an example of the kind of data that you would be able to see and that my students in 696 spatial statistics do see all the time. And I ask them to work on developing methods and fitting models for these kinds of data sets. There's multiple sensors here in the Pennsylvania area, and we have like air quality levels. And then you can use these to assess how people are breathing in this air and having issues or non-issues for their lungs, for example. And the other topic that I'm talking about here is trying to understand the cancer microenvironment. And so the thing that I'm saying is basically that even in this case, we have multiple sensors, right? You can imagine that I'm making a parallel with what we saw before. So here we have medical imaging, such as MRI or CT imaging. We have tissue biopsies, in which you take a little piece of humans' tissues and then take pictures from a microscope. And we have laboratory testing, in which we have other sources of data. And once again, even in this case, there's a spatial aspect. As you can see here, this is a completely made up image of two tissues. This is AI generated. On the left, we have what AI imagines as being healthy tissue, and on the right, some non-healthy tissue. And you see that even AI knows that the unhealthy tissue is different, from a spatial perspective relative to healthy tissue. Even in this case, if you look at real data, so this is now on the left, you see like the markers of different cell types, and you see that there's a spatial structure in all of these cell types and how they are patterned in the tissue. And so the idea even here, just like we saw in the air quality monitoring case, is that we can use spatial methods to model these data and find explanations for how things change and how things are and why they are the way that we see them. And so how do we link them? So the similarities are of course that we have in both cases data with spatial and temporal coordinates. The data are multivariate, so it means that at every coordinate we have multiple sources of information, such as multiple cell types maybe, or multiple environmental variables. And in both cases, we have high-resolution sensors. We have massive data sets. And this is going to be a problem because many of the methods we develop are actually not very scalable, meaning that they don't extend to very large data sets. And so one topic of research that I've been interested in is in how you develop methods that do scale to massive data sets. And that's important and very influential. And we have covariate information. You can imagine like the subject information in case of medical imaging, or the environmental information in case of the environment. And we have complex interactions, of course, and multimodality, as I was saying, that just means that you have ground level data and then satellite imaging, and they tell you kind of the same information, but in a different way. But the differences are that we have just one planet Earth, so that is the one subject that we have in the case of the environmental studies, whereas in the cancer studies we have multiple subjects. And then in the environmental case we have observational data, whereas in medical studies we possibly may have randomized trials, and so a treatment effect that we want to measure, for example. And the treatment effect may be different according, in space. So that's not very simple to estimate. And so in all of this, what I'm saying is you can use Bayesian methods. And maybe Bayesian methods are the glue that can help you bridge like these areas that look different, but actually I'm arguing they're very similar. And in a Bayesian method, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar or have heard about Bayesian methods? Many of them. So yeah, that's very good. So we have a probability model for the data. That's like our instruments, right? So okay, English as second language. I don't remember how things are called. Speaking of internationals, yes, where you put the colors and the instrument you use to draw. Okay, that, but it's not there yet, right? So we have prior uncertainty. The palette, yes, the color palette, yes, of course, and the what's it called? Brush. Thank you. It was not that difficult, right? I think I should have known. But see, I'm work on other things, not an artist. I mean, yeah, I let AI do everything here. So again, we have prior uncertainty, so kind of an idea of how things should look like before we see the data, right? And then we observe the data, we see which color we are supposed to use, and then we draw, like you use the brush to draw whatever the solution is to the problem, right? So the posterior is just the updated uncertainty that we have about model parameters that we don't know anything about, except for the prior information. So, and here I'm not gonna go over it too much, but essentially we may have data for subject at some location. So you can imagine that this is potentially the pixel of an image or for a subject. And if we only have Earth, then I is just Earth. And then we have the model for all subjects. We want to explain the data with some parameter that we don't know. We want to estimate that. And then that parameter can be simple, such as a number, but also a whole function, such as a surface, right? So that is when, for example, we want to estimate the effects in space. That effect in space is, a big image. And so the prior on surfaces that we use is typically a spatial stochastic process, such as a Gaussian process. So then, in our Bayesian framework, we observe the data. So here would be the data for example, multiple subjects, I think, in the medical setting. And then we update the uncertainty that we used to have, the prior, using the data and find the posterior. And you see here, basically, I'm applying the same method, right? So we have a rough idea of how the shapes should be, and but we don't know how to color them. And then we put color on that. So that's a representation of how a Bayesian framework would work. And once we get the posterior, so the goal of a Bayesian model is to get the posterior. Once we had the posterior, we can do everything. We can do test of hypotheses. We can give you uncertainty intervals. We can make predictions. Everything we need to do is inside the posterior. So the goal is always to find the posterior. And in the satellite imaging case, so for example, in this case, you have a situation in which you have snow and trees, and you know that the water cycle, especially with in a situation of climate change, is very important for not only directly to understand what the effect of climate change is, but also downstream the effect on people. You can imagine in California this year they had a lot of water, but the year prior they were having no water at all. And then if there's a lot of snow accumulation, then there's going to be water in the spring. If not, there's none. And so that impacts not just the local areas that have or do not have snow, but overall society. And so in understanding those changing and making predictions is very important in the future. And here we use scalable Bayesian Gaussian process regression methods to basically be able to analyze these massive sources, massive quantities of data in this very complicated setting in which there's a multivariate outcome, and you get all of the things that I was mentioning, including uncertainty intervals and so on. And in the, this is ongoing research now. This is in the tissue biopsy case. We have multiple subjects, and with some people were asking about collaborations with external departments. So this is a collaboration that's ongoing with the Center for Cancer Bioinformatics at the med school. I don't remember its name, CCMB. So there's a PhD student and a postdoc there that are working with me to develop this software package that is basically an extension of the software that I was developing earlier for the environmental sciences to this situation in which you have multiple subjects. And you want to understand how the tumor microenvironment changes in time and space for the different stages of cancer, for example, right? So that would explain how cancer impacts cells and the relationships that they have with each other. And so this is like initial steps in fitting those models and trying to understand how things work. Again, this is ongoing research. We are planning to have something out by the summer, but yeah. So if you were coming to Michigan, you would expect, not just with me, but of course with everybody, that you can be exposed to a variety of problems and a variety of people to work with. And so I think that's very appealing. I think that's very advantageous for your career in the future because you can always say that you have had experience in a variety of things as opposed to just working on a narrow set of things. So again, why Bayesian paradigm? This is like trying to convince you to use this, not necessarily to convince you to come to Michigan, but a lot of people in Michigan Bayesians. No. So it's a flexible strategy for complex data. It's based on the math of probability. It forces you, and my students know that it forces you, I force them, to make clear assumption on what your prior is, what your model is. And that's always the question that I ask the students, and some of them can attest to that they need to be very accurate and specific and detailed in how they define everything, because that's the nature of a Bayesian model, to be like very clear. And again, this forces the user, of a software package, for example, to think about what you're doing, the science of what you're doing. It's not just about running a couple lines of code and getting the answer. You kind of need to understand what's going on because it's, complex but also flexible, and it's very interpretable. So you should be taking advantage of that. And that leads to reproducible science. I mean, there's always talk about having this crisis of reproducibility that, people run studies and then others run the same study, trying to figure out exactly the same steps, and then the results don't reproduce. And so this being very transparent, very clear, that it's the nature of a Bayesian model allows you to be, hopefully, more reproducible. And so, more impactful in the longer term future. And so if you want to have like some references about what I've been doing, here's some. Then I think I'm done with the presentation today. I hope I have motivated you enough. But you can talk to me or anybody else here. I think it's going to be a very good move if you move. Thank you. Do we have questions? I hope I haven't scared you with my talk about courses. Yes, please. Oh, we have another. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jennifer. So you explained earlier that you're doing stuff both with like the cancer stuff and the climate change, and then you said for the cancer stuff you were collaborating, like in the health departments. And then for the climate change, who are you collaborating with for those studies?
Thank you for the question. So yes, as I've moved here, basically my initial step was to try to establish some relationship with people at Michigan, right? Because it's important to have like your foot in like multiple places, right? And so the first thing that I could find was actually this collaboration with people at the med school. I think they're at Michigan Medicine. Computational medicine and bioinformatics. And so, because they have access to data, right? So for me, the goal is to have access to cool data that inspires new models. And so that's what I did. In terms of the climate change part, that's all of the collaborations that I had before coming to Michigan. So I have my postdoc advisors are part of that. I have a collaboration that was ongoing with George Washington University that was like related to modeling the, I have it here. Yes, the changes in the speed at which trees become green during the year as a consequence of climate change. And so that's another part. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, my name is Emily Marin. I have a question. You mentioned earlier something about, it was particularly large language models, right? That you were trying to get them to be more transparent.
So, I mean, yes, ask the question, please.
So,
I don't want to interrupt you. Yeah.
How exactly do you propose to do that? Because I do a bit with large language models and some other models, but they're very, very not transparent at all about how they're thinking.
Exactly.
So I'm wondering how you're proposing to make them expose how they're coming to their conclusions aside from probability maps.
I completely agree with you that they're very obscure in how they give you the perfect answers sometimes, right? So I think there's a paper that was published recently in Nature, I want to say. I think it was a group of Stanford researchers that used a very large data set of images, and they were able to predict or make predictions about cancer development using images, right? And so I read that, and I'm like, okay, cool. So 99% accuracy in making a prediction on your cancer stage based on images, that's very accurate, but how did you do it, right? And so I don't think that it's necessarily easy to reconstruct an AI model so that it tells you exactly how it's doing those things, because it's the nature of those models to be deep, and every layer in those hierarchies means that you're losing interpretability, because there's like a billion parameters that all of them have different effects. So what I'm actually saying is that we could potentially use the results of those predictions, consider them as our data, and make them look like noisy data, and then try to, because now we have a lot more, the data can be, we don't have to just rely on the human labeling of images and cancer stages. We can use a large language model. We can have a massive data set of images, and then we can fit a Bayesian model to those images, taking into account the noisy. What did you say at the beginning?
Analyzing the output and then comparing it to the input and what a human would do, and then you're kind of interpolating it.
So the AI method, the AI model is typically trying to do that, right? So you give it a training set, and then it's learning from whatever the human does, and it's going to try to mimic the human as much as possible. But the human you could ask, and the AI model you don't, right? And so the AI model will generate a ton of data, though, whereas the human would take a long time to generate the same amount of data. So now that we have a lot of data, we know the answers to this question, and it's pretty accurate. We can trust the AI model that's going to give us something that's maybe noisy, maybe not always 100% accurate, but pretty close. So that's nice. And then we can just use that data and reanalyze that data and kind of try to give an explanation of why the AI model came up with those answers. And I think Bayesian methods are actually, Bayesian methods, and I mean interpretable and flexible Bayesian methods that you can interpret and you can understandable Bayesian methods. There's a whole line of research on that. Can actually do that for you, right? So they can tell you, here's why the AI model gave you that answer. I think that's a very potentially powerful thing that we can do, because people are expecting that as in the future. I think it's not just going to be limited to, oh yeah, sure, and you can see that when you use ChatGPT, right? So sometimes it's like, okay, thank you for all of that, cloud of text, but I mean, it sounds okay, but maybe I want to have some input more, which is why we need prompt engineering then. So, but yeah, I hope that answered the question.
All right, thank you so much, Michele. That was excellent. Graphics, just phenomenal as usual.
That's AI.
Thank you so much.
Prompt engineering.